When my son-in-law handed me that envelope with a bow on it and called it a gift, I almost thanked him. I almost smiled, hugged him, and said what a thoughtful surprise. I was 67 years old, standing in my own kitchen, wearing the apron my late husband Earl had given me for our 30th anniversary. And I came this close to being grateful for the thing that was designed to erase me. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just my story. It's the story of every woman who was ever made to feel like a burden, like a problem to be solved, like something that needed to be quietly moved out of the way so other people could live more comfortably. It's the story of what happens when one of those women finally decides she has had enough. My name is Loretta Mae Hutchins. I'm 67 years old, and I was born and raised in Harlan County, Kentucky, where the mountains press in close on all sides, and people learn early that life is not gentle, and neither are the people who love you. I raised my daughter Gwendolyn in that same county, in a house that my husband Earl and I built piece by piece over the better part of 20 years. I buried Earl in the churchyard 3 miles from that house. I planted roses over his grave because he always said yellow roses smelled like his mother's kitchen, and I drive out there every Sunday, rain or shine, to make sure those roses are tended. That house, that kitchen, those roses, that was my whole world. And Marcus Tilden, my daughter's husband of 11 years, a man I had welcomed into my home and my family and my heart, decided all of it needed to go. Decided I needed to go. What he didn't count on was that Loretta Mae Hutchins doesn't go anywhere she doesn't choose to go, and she certainly doesn't stay gone. Before I tell you what I did with those tickets, and I will tell you every last detail, I need you to understand who I was before Marcus and who I became because of him. Because the woman who opened that envelope and the woman who closed the final chapter of this story are 2 different people. And the distance between them is the whole point. Before we go any further into this story, I want to take just a moment to speak directly to you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from. Stories like mine don't find their way to people by accident. If you're here, something brought you. Maybe curiosity, maybe recognition, maybe your own version of an envelope with a bow on it. This channel is completely free, and every story we share comes from real women who refuse to be silent. If this story matters to you, please take 1 second right now to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another one. Hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. And drop a comment below telling me what you think so far, and let us know what city or country you're watching from. Your support is what allows these stories to reach the women who need them most. Thank you. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Harlan County in the 1950s was a place that operated by its own set of rules, and those rules were understood by everyone who lived there without ever needing to be written down. You worked. You kept your head down. You took care of your family first and yourself last. And if there was anything left over after all of that, any scrap of time or energy or ambition, you were considered lucky. Most people didn't have leftovers. I was born on a February morning in 1957, the second of 4 children raised by my parents, Raymond and Hattie Combs. My daddy worked the coal mines, same as his daddy before him and his daddy before that. My mother worked everything else, the garden, the kitchen, the schoolwork, the church committees, the neighbor who needed soup when she was sick, the cousin who needed a place to sleep when things got bad at home. Mama worked without stopping, without complaining, and without anyone ever thinking to ask if she needed help. I watched her do it my entire childhood, and I absorbed the lesson the way children absorb everything, completely and without question. This is what women do. This is what it means to be a good woman. You pour yourself out for other people, and you do it with a smile, and you call it love. Our house on Clover Fork Road was small by anyone's standard. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that served as the main gathering room for the whole family, because the living room was where Daddy slept when his back was bad and he couldn't make the stairs. We had a wood stove and a garden and a clothesline strung between two oak trees that Daddy had planted the year before I was born. In the winter, the pipes froze. In the summer, the heat was something you wore like a second skin. We didn't have much, but I never felt poor in the way that word implies emptiness. We were full of something: family, noise, obligation, love. I met Earl Hutchins at a church social when I was 19 years old. He was 22, already working at the Evarts lumberyard, and he had the kind of laugh that made you feel like whatever room you were in had suddenly gotten warmer. Earl wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room and demanded attention. He was steady, reliable, the kind of man who fixed things quietly, without announcing that he'd done it, and who never once made me feel like my opinions were less important than his. We were married in June of 1977 in the First Baptist Church of Harlan, in a ceremony that my mother planned mostly by herself because I was working double shifts at the diner on Main Street and saving every dollar I could toward the down payment on the land we'd found on the county road just outside of town. We had a cake with buttercream frosting, a borrowed dress, and 63 people crowded into a church that held maybe 50. I remember thinking, standing at that altar with Earl's hands wrapped around mine, that I had never in my life wanted anything as much as I wanted exactly this. Gwendolyn was born in 1981, 4 years into our marriage, after 2 pregnancies that didn't go to term, and a period of grief so heavy I thought some mornings it might actually have physical weight. She came into the world on a Tuesday in October, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with Earl's dark eyes and a cry so fierce the nurse laughed and said that baby knows what she wants. I held her in that hospital room in Harlan and made her the same silent promise every mother makes and spends the rest of her life keeping, that I would give her everything I had, every last thing. And I did. Earl and I built our life around Gwendolyn the same way we built the house, piece by piece, with our own hands, with whatever materials we could afford, with a stubbornness that people in Harlan County have always mistaken for courage. Earl added the second bedroom when she was 2. I went back to school at night when she was 6, finishing the bookkeeping certificate I'd started before the wedding, and then set aside when the babies didn't come, and then came, and then didn't. I got a job at the county tax assessor's office when Gwendolyn was in 2nd grade, and I stayed there for 22 years, working my way up from file clerk to assistant administrator, making a salary that was modest by any measure but enough. Enough to keep the lights on, enough to keep Gwendolyn in school clothes and soccer cleats, and eventually a college fund that wasn't large but was real. Earl had his first heart attack in 2009. He was 54 years old, which is young for a heart attack and old for coal country, where the work takes years off a man the way sandpaper takes wood. He survived it, changed his diet, started walking every evening down the county road and back, and seemed, for a while, to get better. The second heart attack came in 2014. He did not survive that one. I was 57 years old when I buried my husband of 37 years. I stood at his grave on a gray November morning with Gwendolyn on one side and Earl's brother Dale on the other, and I felt something shift inside me. A tectonic kind of shift. Deep and slow and permanent. Something that had always been part of my architecture simply wasn't there anymore, and everything above it had to redistribute itself to account for the loss. It took years to understand what had changed. It took Marcus Tilden to make me finally see it clearly. Gwendolyn had met Marcus 3 years before Earl died. She brought him home for Thanksgiving in 2011, and I remember being impressed by him. He was polished in a way that people from Harlan County often aren't. Not because they lack the intelligence or the character, but because polish costs money and time, and we generally had more pressing things to spend both on. Marcus was from Louisville. He'd gone to the University of Kentucky on a partial scholarship, gotten a business degree, and worked his way into a mid-level management position at a regional insurance company. He wore button-down shirts that fit correctly. He said please and thank you. He complimented my cooking with specificity. Not just, this is delicious, but, the way you season these green beans is something else, Mrs. Hutchins. I liked him. I want to be clear about that, because what came later can make it easy to revise history, to say I always had a bad feeling, to claim I saw through him from the start. I didn't. I liked Marcus Tilden, and I was glad my daughter had found a man who seemed to value her. They married in August of 2013, a year and a half after Gwendolyn's father was diagnosed with the heart condition that would eventually take him. The wedding was in Louisville, at a venue Marcus's family had selected, and it was the first time I understood that my place in my daughter's new life might be smaller than I had imagined. I was consulted on very little. I was seated in the right pew at the right time, and handed the right flowers, and smiled in the right photographs. And I told myself that was fine. That was how it should be. Gwendolyn was starting her own life, her own family, her own chapter, and it was not my place to be the center of it. What I didn't recognize then was that not being the center and being systematically edged toward the margins are very different things, and Marcus Tilden knew the difference better than anyone. After Earl died in November of 2014, Gwendolyn called every week and visited once a month, sometimes more in the early months when the grief was fresh and visible enough that even Marcus could see it required attention. I was grateful for those visits. I clung to them in a way I'm not entirely proud of, because clinging had never been my nature. But grief does things to a person's nature. It softens edges that were once hard and hardens things that were once soft. And for a while, I was something unfamiliar, even to myself. The first sign that something was wrong came in the spring of 2016. It was a small thing, small enough that I filed it away and told myself I was being sensitive. It was a Saturday in late April, one of those Kentucky spring mornings that smell like wet earth and apple blossom and make you feel briefly, powerfully convinced that the world is fundamentally good. I had just finished my morning coffee and was pulling on my gardening gloves to go out and tend to the roses when Gwendolyn called. We had a good conversation. She told me about a promotion she was hoping for at the hospital where she worked in medical billing, and I told her about the new bird feeder I'd put up by the kitchen window and the pair of cardinals who had already found it. Then, near the end of the call, she said something that struck me as slightly off. The way a note in a song can be slightly flat, and you notice it even if you can't name why. She said, "Marcus thinks it might be a good idea for you to start thinking about selling the house, Mom. Just, down the line, when it gets to be too much." I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and the gardening gloves still on my hands, and I felt a small, cold thing settle somewhere behind my sternum. Not panic, not anger. Just a kind of quiet alertness, the way a deer freezes when it hears something in the brush that might be a predator or might be nothing at all. "The house is fine," I said. "I'm fine. The upkeep is manageable." Of course, Gwendolyn said, and her voice had a careful quality to it, like she was reading from a script she'd been given and was trying to deliver naturally. "It's just something to think about. No rush." I told myself Marcus was being practical, that men like Marcus, organized, forward-planning, financially minded, thought in terms of contingencies and future costs. I told myself he was trying to be responsible, not presumptuous. I hung up the phone, went out to tend my roses, and by the time I came back inside with dirt under my nails and the smell of spring on my clothes, I had almost convinced myself the conversation meant nothing at all. But I remembered it. That's the thing about the small, cold things. You remember them. The second sign came that summer, in July of 2016. Marcus and Gwendolyn had driven down for the 4th of July weekend, which was a tradition we'd had since the early years of their marriage. They'd come to Harlan, we'd have a cookout in the backyard, watch the fireworks from the hill behind the Baptist church with half the neighborhood. It was one of the things I genuinely looked forward to, one of the touchstones that made the calendar feel organized around something worth waiting for. That year, Marcus spent most of Saturday afternoon on his phone. I noticed it because he'd always been better about that at family gatherings, present in a way that felt deliberate, like he understood that being present was expected and met that expectation reliably. But that Saturday, he was distracted in a way he didn't bother to hide. He took several calls in the backyard, and I could hear the low murmur of his voice through the kitchen window while I was putting together the potato salad. At dinner, he made a comment that landed wrong. We were talking about the neighborhood, how the Caudle place 2 doors down had been sold to a young couple from Lexington, how property values in the county were shifting in ways that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. And Marcus looked around my kitchen with an expression I can only describe as appraising, the kind of look an estate agent gives a house before quoting a price. He said, "This place would actually do well in the current market, Loretta. Square footage, land, the original woodwork, buyers want that now." I looked at him across the potato salad and the deviled eggs and the watermelon that Gwendolyn had cut into neat triangles the way I'd taught her, and I smiled and said something non-committal about how I wasn't planning on going anywhere. Marcus smiled back, but his eyes were still doing that appraising thing, like he was calculating something I wasn't being shown. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in the bed I had shared with Earl for 37 years and stared at the ceiling and listened to the tree frogs outside the window and told myself I was being paranoid. That Marcus was a practical man who thought practically. That I should be grateful my daughter had married someone who thought ahead. The third sign was harder to rationalize, and it came in the fall of 2016, October, which has always been my least favorite month since Earl died in November, and October feels like that month's long shadow. Gwendolyn called on a Wednesday evening, and she sounded strained in the way she sounds when she's trying to present something difficult as reasonable. She told me that Marcus had been doing some research, and already that phrase, "Marcus had been doing some research," made my stomach tighten, because Marcus researching something about my life meant Marcus had been thinking about my life in a way I hadn't invited, and that he'd found several very nice assisted living communities in the Louisville area. Not nursing homes, she was quick to add. Communities, places with activities and social events and medical support on site. "I'm 60 years old, Gwendolyn," I said. My voice was very quiet. I had learned from my mother that the quieter your voice gets, the more serious the moment, and I was conscious of keeping mine steady. I have no medical conditions that require that level of support. I'm working part-time at the tax office. I tend my garden. I drive myself everywhere I need to go. "I know, Mom, I know," Gwendolyn said, and there was something in her voice that I recognized with a cold, sinking recognition. It was the sound of someone who has already had this conversation with someone else and has been given their lines. It's just about planning ahead, being proactive. "I appreciate the thought," I said, "but my plan is to stay in my home." There was a pause. Then Gwendolyn said, "Marcus thinks—" "I know what Marcus thinks," I said, and that was the end of that conversation. I sat in my kitchen after I hung up the phone, and I tried to be fair. I tried to be fair to Marcus, to Gwendolyn, to the version of events in which they were simply two people who loved me and worried about me, and expressed that worry in a way that was clumsy and presumptuous, but ultimately well-intentioned. I tried very hard to believe that version. But the cold thing behind my sternum had gotten a little heavier. The fourth sign came at Christmas, and by this point I was paying closer attention, though I was still not ready to name what I was paying attention to. The holiday gathering was at Gwendolyn and Marcus's house in Louisville, a newer construction in a subdivision called Whispering Oaks, where every house was some shade of beige, and the lots were small enough that you could hear your neighbor's television through the wall. It was a comfortable home. Marcus had furnished it with the same deliberate, careful taste he brought to everything. Nothing flashy, nothing cheap, everything in its correct and appropriate place. I arrived on Christmas Eve and was given the guest room, which was pleasant and impersonal in the way guest rooms always are. A bed with a good mattress and too many decorative pillows. A framed print of a landscape that had been selected to match the curtains. A bedside table with nothing on it. I unpacked my small suitcase and hung my church dress in the closet, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room and thought about how different it was from waking up in my own house, surrounded by the specific and irreplaceable evidence of my own life. On Christmas morning, after the gifts and the breakfast, Marcus suggested we take a drive. He'd heard about a new development on the east side of Louisville. Independent living apartments, he called them. Very modern. Beautiful amenities. Just to look, he said. Just to see. Gwendolyn glanced at me with an expression I had trouble reading. Not quite apologetic. Not quite conspiratorial. Something in between, like she was watching to see which way this would go. I said no, firmly and clearly, and with a smile, so that the no had no hooks in it, nothing anyone could pull on. I said I had no interest in looking at apartments because I had a home and I intended to keep it. Marcus nodded agreeably and said, of course, no pressure. But for the rest of the visit, he had that appraising look again, the one that made me feel like furniture being considered for removal. I drove home to Harlan on December 26th in the slate-gray early morning before anyone else was up, and I sat in my driveway for a long moment after I turned off the engine, looking at the front of my house, the porch Earl had built, the window boxes I'd painted yellow, the door with the wreath still on it from Advent, and I felt something that I can only describe as territorial. Not quite fear, more like warning. The fifth sign arrived in February of 2017, and this one came with documentation. Gwendolyn called to tell me that Marcus had found a financial planner who specialized in what he called elder care transition planning, a phrase that made my skin prickle, and that this planner had some very interesting ideas about how to handle the house proceeds if and when I decided to sell. Marcus had already had a preliminary conversation with this person. About my house, about my finances, without consulting me. I asked Gwendolyn, very carefully, whether she felt that was appropriate, whether she thought it was something Marcus should be doing without my knowledge or consent. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's just trying to help, Mom. He worries about you being up there alone." I have thought about that sentence many times since. The particular construction of it. Not we worry, but he worries. As if Marcus's concern was separate from Gwendolyn's, as if it existed in its own compartment for its own reasons. "Tell Marcus I appreciate his concern," I said, "and that my finances are my own business." That night I called my friend Patsy Napier, who has been my closest friend since we were both working the early shift at the diner 40 years ago, and who knows me better than almost anyone still living. I told her about the financial planner and the assisted living apartments and the property value comments, and Patsy was quiet for a long time, in that way she has of taking things seriously before she speaks. "Loretta," she said finally, "that man is building a case." "A case for what?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. "A case for getting you out of that house," she said, "and into somewhere he can control what happens to it." I told her she was being dramatic, but I didn't sleep that night either. The sixth sign was the one that took the rationalization right out of me. It was March of 2017, and I had driven up to Louisville for Gwendolyn's birthday. She was turning 36, and I had baked her a chocolate layer cake with cream cheese frosting the way she'd always loved since she was small. I arrived on a Friday afternoon and let myself in with the spare key Gwendolyn had given me years ago. I wasn't expected until 4 o'clock, but I'd made good time on the drive and arrived closer to 2. The house was empty. Marcus's car was gone. Gwendolyn's was in the driveway, which meant she was likely at the gym around the corner where she went on Friday afternoons. I set the cake box carefully on the kitchen counter and was about to settle in the living room with a book when I noticed the laptop open on the kitchen table. I would not have looked at it under any other circumstances. It wasn't my business, and I knew it. But the screen was open to an email, and my name was in the subject line. That's all it took. Just my name. I stood there in my daughter's kitchen in my good traveling coat, and I read an email Marcus had written to someone named Greg Tillman, whom I would later learn was a real estate attorney in Louisville. The email was detailed, It discussed the Clover Fork Road property, my house, the house Earl built, in terms of assessed value and potential sale price and market timing. It discussed something called a guardianship petition and the requirements for establishing that an elderly parent was unable to manage their own affairs. It used the word resistant to describe me, as though my refusal to leave my home was a symptom rather than a preference. And at the bottom of the email, Marcus had written, "I think once she's settled into Meadow Glen and the house is listed, she'll come around." The hard part is the initial transition. Gwendolyn is still on the fence, but I'm working on her. Meadow Glen, that was the name. A care facility in eastern Louisville, 40 miles from my home, 40 miles from Earl's grave, 40 miles from my roses and my bird feeder and my garden and everything I had built of my own life. And Marcus Tilden was working on my daughter to put me there. I stood in that kitchen and I read that email twice. Then I took my phone out of my coat pocket and I photographed it. Every word. Then I straightened up, smoothed my coat, put my phone away, and went and sat in the living room with my book and waited for my daughter to come home for her birthday. My hands didn't shake. I was proud of that afterward. My hands did not shake. The seventh and final sign, though by that point it was less a sign and more a confirmed pattern, came in May of 2017. When Marcus presented Gwendolyn with a proposal, he had clearly been refining for months. He did it at dinner, on a Sunday evening when I happened to be visiting, and I have wondered since whether that was deliberate or simply a miscalculation on his part. Marcus didn't always account for the possibility that I was paying closer attention than he assumed. He laid out, over the pasta Gwendolyn had made from a recipe I'd taught her, a complete timeline. The house would be listed in September. I would move to Meadow Glen in October, which he described as a gentle transition period. By December, he said, everything would be settled, and I would be, he used this word precisely, comfortable. He looked at me when he said it, direct eye contact with that flat, measuring expression, as if daring me to object in a way he could use against me. I looked back at him. Then I looked at Gwendolyn, who was staring at her pasta. Then I picked up my fork and I ate my dinner, and I said nothing at all. Because by May of 2017, I already had a plan. And the worst thing you can do when you have a plan is let the other person know it exists. The tension that had been building for over a year had reached a point, by the summer of 2017, where I could no longer pretend it was background noise. It was the whole room. It was every phone call with my daughter, every visit, every email I knew Marcus was sending to attorneys and financial planners and care facility administrators. It was the weight I carried when I woke up every morning in the house Earl had built and looked at the walls and wondered how many mornings I had left in them. I want to explain what it feels like to be the subject of someone else's plan for your own life. It is not precisely like being a prisoner, because there are no physical restraints. It is more like watching someone build a cage around you, methodically, piece by piece, with great care and patience, while they smile and tell you they're doing it for your own good. You can see the bars going up. You can touch them. But if you say, "You're putting me in a cage," the person building it looks at you with profound concern and says, "These aren't bars, Loretta. This is care. This is planning. This is us loving you." What made it complicated, what made it the most painful thing I've ever navigated, harder in some ways even than losing Earl, was Gwendolyn. My daughter was not a villain. I need you to understand that clearly and completely, because the story doesn't work if she's a villain. Gwendolyn was a woman who loved her mother and who also loved her husband. And Marcus had spent years, subtle, patient, water-drip years, reshaping the way she saw me. Gradually replacing capable, independent woman with aging parent who needs managing. Gradually making my self-sufficiency look like stubbornness and my independence look like a problem to be solved. I had spent enough years in that kitchen, watching Mama do everything for everyone and be thanked for none of it, to recognize the mechanism. Gwendolyn had been trained, gently and consistently, to see her mother as a dependent. And once you see someone that way, it becomes very hard to see them any other way. My attempts to talk to Gwendolyn directly that summer were exercises in careful futility. She would listen, nod, say the right things, and then, within 24 hours, she would call back with some new angle Marcus had given her. A new fact about care facility amenities, a new statistic about elderly people living alone, a new gentle suggestion that I was being, and she used his word, resistant. Each conversation felt like I was talking to my daughter through glass. She was right there, but the layer between us was real and solid and installed by someone else. I began to understand, in those months, that the battle was not really about the house. The house was the object of the conflict. Yes, the property Marcus wanted to convert to cash and the life he wanted to dismantle. But the actual terrain of the war was Gwendolyn's perception of me. If Marcus could convince Gwendolyn that her mother was frail, confused, unable to manage, then the path to everything else opened up naturally. The power of attorney conversations became logical. The guardianship petition became reasonable. The care facility became kindness rather than kidnapping. And in July of 2017, Marcus made his move. The move that made every other move make sense in retrospect, the way the last piece of a puzzle reveals what the image was always going to be. He arrived at my door on a Thursday morning in July with an envelope. Gwendolyn was not with him, and looking back, I think that was intentional. He didn't want a witness to my reaction who might feel something complicated about it. He was alone, in one of his correct button-down shirts, holding the envelope with both hands and wearing the expression of a man delivering something he expected to be received with gratitude. "Loretta," he said. He never called me Mom, always Loretta, which I had once read as respectful distance and now understood as deliberate refusal of intimacy. "Gwendolyn and I wanted to do something really special for you. We know this transition has been something you've been nervous about, and we wanted to make it as easy as possible." He held out the envelope. I took it. There was a bow on it, a small blue bow pressed to the upper left corner, the kind you press and stick onto gift wrap. The bow was the detail that stayed with me afterward. The bow was the thing that made the whole performance complete. This consciously, carefully constructed presentation of an act of control as an act of generosity. Inside the envelope was a packet of papers. A welcome packet, it was called, from Meadow Glen Assisted Living and Memory Care Community. My name was printed at the top in a cheerful font. There was a room assignment, room 114, a single with a garden view. There were move-in instructions, a list of what to bring and what the facility would provide. And there, paper-clipped to the back of the packet, were 2 printed airline tickets from Louisville to Harlan for the following Saturday, to transport whatever I needed from the house before it was listed for sale. One-way tickets, not round trip, one way, from my home to the place he had chosen for me. I looked at those tickets for a long time, long enough that Marcus shifted his weight slightly on my front porch, which I noticed with the specific acuity you develop when you're holding something that has just reordered your understanding of the world. I looked at the tickets, and I thought about Earl's grave with the yellow roses, and the kitchen where 4 generations of family had sat and eaten and argued and celebrated, and the garden that was currently at peak summer bloom, and my friend Patsy 3 streets over, and the regulars at the part-time job I still kept at the tax office, and 22 years of filing and organizing and knowing every piece of Harlan County's paper infrastructure. And then I looked up at Marcus Tilden. "Thank you," I said. "This is very thoughtful." He smiled, relieved and satisfied, the smile of a man who has completed a complicated task. He said something about how they just wanted me to be happy and comfortable and taken care of, and I nodded and said, I understood completely, and then I thanked him for driving out, and I closed the door. I stood in my front hallway with that envelope in my hands, and I heard his car back out of my driveway. I waited until the sound of the engine faded entirely, and then I went to the kitchen, sat down at the table where Earl and I had made every major decision of our married life, spread the contents of the envelope out in front of me, and I began to think. Not about what had been done to me. I was past the stage of thinking about that, about what I was going to do about it. If you've ever felt this moment, if you've ever been the person in the room who just had their whole life handed back to them in an envelope like a problem to be solved, I want to ask you right now to hit that like button and leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought when Marcus handed Loretta those one-way tickets. Tell me what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, please, for the women in your life who need these stories, hit subscribe right now. Stories like this one only reach the people who need them because of your support. I am not, by nature, an impulsive woman. This is something Earl always said about me, sometimes admiringly, and sometimes in mild frustration, depending on the circumstances. You think before you move, Loretta. You always think before you move. He was right, and in most situations of my life, that quality served me well. In the summer of 2017, it saved me. I gave myself exactly 1 week from the day Marcus handed me that envelope before I made a single phone call. 1 week of sitting with the facts, laying them out like pieces of a quilt pattern, turning them and examining them and deciding which ones fit where. 1 week of being very quiet and very calm on the outside, while inside something was organizing itself with a clarity and precision that I had never felt before in my 60 years of life. The first thing I needed was information. Not the kind of information Marcus had spent months gathering about me. Asset values, care facility options, legal pathways to guardianship, but my own kind. The kind that a woman who had spent 22 years at the Harlan County Tax Assessor's office had particular access to if she knew where to look and what to ask. On the Monday after Marcus delivered the envelope, I went to work at the tax office. I still worked there 3 mornings a week, keeping the appointment I'd held for decades. And I sat down with my colleague, Louise Bingham, who has been handling property records at the county office for 30 years, and who knows the paper trail of every piece of land in Harlan County the way a librarian knows the stacks. I told Louise, carefully and without elaborating on the why, that I had some questions about the process for property transfer. What was required, what the documentation looked like, what protections existed for a property owner who had not initiated or consented to a transfer. Louise, who is one of the sharpest women I've ever known and who can read between lines the way other people read headlines, looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "I'm asking about the process," I said. "The process," Louise said, "involves several very clear protections for the property owner, and if anyone at all, tries to initiate a sale or transfer without the owner's documented consent, there is a very clear paper trail and a very clear set of legal remedies." She paused. "Are we done talking about the process in the abstract, or do you want the specific details?" I wanted the specific details. Over the next 2 weeks, Louise walked me through everything I needed to know about property protection in Kentucky, about what a guardianship petition required, about how to contest one, about what documentation was necessary to establish that a property owner was fully competent and had not consented to any transfer. She gave me names, an estate attorney in Harlan who handled elder law, a legal aid organization in Louisville that dealt specifically with cases involving older adults and financial manipulation. She wrote the names on a piece of notebook paper in her careful, even handwriting and slid it across the desk without making a big thing of it. "You're one of the most capable women I've ever met in my life, Loretta Hutchins," she said. "I hope whoever needs to hear that is listening." I folded the paper, put it in my coat pocket, and went home to make my phone calls. The estate attorney's name was Gerald Whitmore, and he had an office on Center Street in Harlan that he'd occupied for 30 years. He was a serious man in his early 60s, with reading glasses he wore on a chain and a manner that was precise without being cold. I sat across from him the following Tuesday afternoon and told him everything, the emails, the financial planner, the care facility packet, the one-way tickets, and I watched him take notes in his careful way, and when I was finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been thorough," he said. "The photograph of the email is important." "I assumed it would be," I said. He laid out my options with the methodical clarity that made me glad I'd chosen him. First, I could have a document drawn up, a comprehensive statement of competency and property intent, witnessed and notarized, that established formally and legally that I was in full possession of my faculties, was not in need of a guardian, and had not consented to any sale or transfer of my property. This document, filed with the county, would make a guardianship petition significantly more difficult to pursue. Second, I could speak with the legal aid organization about the email as potential evidence of financial elder abuse, which is a specific legal category in Kentucky with specific remedies. Third, and this was the option that Gerald offered almost as an afterthought, but which caught my attention immediately and never let go, I could get ahead of Marcus's timeline in a way he would not expect. "What do you mean, get ahead of his timeline?" I asked. Gerald looked at me over his reading glasses. "I mean that if your son-in-law's plan depends on a specific sequence of events, you go to the care facility, the house gets listed, the proceeds are managed by parties he's chosen, then disrupting any one of those steps disrupts the entire plan. And the most efficient step to disrupt is the first one." He meant the care facility. He meant Meadow Glen and room 114 and the move-in instructions and the one-way tickets. "If you're not there," Gerald said, "the rest of the plan has no starting point." I sat with that for a moment. "So you're saying the answer to a one-way ticket is to go somewhere he doesn't know about?" Gerald smiled, just slightly, the smile of a man who has spent 30 years watching people figure things out. "That's one way to put it, Mrs. Hutchins. That's certainly one way to put it." I went home that evening and I called Patsy. Patsy Napier has been my best friend for 40 years, and she is the only person in my life with whom I have never had to explain the full situation before she understood it. I told her what Gerald had said, that the answer to Marcus's plan was to remove myself from his timeline entirely. And there was a silence on the other end of the phone that I recognized as Patsy thinking hard. "Where would you go?" she asked. That was the question. And it was the question that opened up a possibility I hadn't previously allowed myself to consider. Because the answer, the real answer, the one I'd been not quite thinking for weeks, was not another city in Kentucky. It was not a compromise or a halfway measure. It was a complete and total redirection of my own life towards something I had wanted for a long time, and had never permitted myself because there was always a reason to wait. My sister-in-law, Rosellen Hutchins, Earl's younger sister, had moved to Asheville, North Carolina in 2010. She and her husband Calvin had bought a small house in the West Asheville neighborhood, close enough to the mountains to see them from their porch, in a community of artists and retirees and young families that was as different from Harlan County as anything I'd ever encountered. Rosellen had been inviting me to visit for years. She had, in fact, been inviting me to move there, or at least consider it, since Earl died. "There's a good community here," she always said. "Good people. You'd be surprised how much you'd love it, Loretta." I had always said, maybe someday. Someday had arrived in the form of a welcome packet from Meadow Glen and a pair of one-way tickets that Marcus Tilden had never expected me to use for anything other than the purpose he intended. I called Rosellen that night. I told her I was ready to visit Asheville. She was so happy she cried. But I was not done planning. Visiting Asheville was the destination. The plan itself required considerably more construction, and I built it with the same attention I'd brought to everything else in my life, piece by piece, material by material, with my own hands. The second critical piece of the plan was the house. Marcus's entire strategy depended on my house being sold, the proceeds presumably going through channels he had a hand in managing. Gerald Whitmore had already begun drawing up the competency documentation. But I needed to go further than simply blocking Marcus's ability to sell it. I needed to act first. I had a conversation with Gerald about a trust, a specific kind of irrevocable living trust in which the property would be transferred into the trust's name, with me as the sole trustee and beneficiary during my lifetime, and with very clear documentation of who would inherit it and under what conditions after my death. This kind of trust, Gerald explained, would make any outside attempt to initiate a sale legally impossible without my consent as trustee. It would also make a guardianship argument vastly more complicated, because the property itself would already have a clear and documented management structure in place. I instructed Gerald to draw up the trust documents. I named my distant cousin Beverly Combs, a level-headed woman of 52 who lived in Lexington and had no particular relationship with Marcus or financial stake in any of this, as the successor trustee in the event of my incapacity. The irrevocable trust was finalized and recorded at the county courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in August of 2017, 3 weeks after Marcus had handed me that envelope with the blue bow. The third piece of the plan involved the finances. I had spent 22 years in the tax assessor's office, and I was not financially naive, whatever Marcus might have concluded from the fact that I drove an 8-year-old Chevrolet and shopped the sales at the Kroger. I had Earl's life insurance payout, which I had kept in a savings account and had not touched. I had my small pension from the county. I had some investments that Earl and I had made quietly over the years, nothing dramatic, but enough that when I sat down and added the columns, I had significantly more financial independence than Marcus Tilden appeared to have accounted for. I moved the savings account, transferred everything to a new account at a credit union in Asheville, a step that Gerald recommended, something Marcus would have no knowledge of and no access to. I called the investment firm and changed the account contacts and mailing address. I was methodical about it. Every financial thread Marcus might have thought he could pull, I redirected it before he had a chance to find it. The fourth piece was the most emotionally complicated, and it required me to make a decision about Gwendolyn that cost me more than everything else combined. I could not tell her what I was doing. Not yet. Not in the planning stages. Because if I told Gwendolyn, she would tell Marcus, not out of malice, but because she had been trained over 11 years to communicate openly with her husband about her mother's decisions, and that training ran deep. If Marcus knew I was planning something, he would accelerate his timeline. He would push for the guardianship petition. He would involve attorneys before I had mine fully in place. I had to protect Gwendolyn from the knowledge of my plan in order to protect both of us from Marcus's reaction to it. That was the hardest thing. Lying to my daughter by omission while planning the thing that would ultimately break her marriage open and force her to see her husband as he actually was. I thought about it constantly during those weeks of preparation. I prayed about it, which is something I do rarely and seriously. I talked to Patsy about it at length, and I came to a place of uncomfortable but necessary peace with it. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is to act without their knowledge in a way that ultimately protects them from something they can't yet see clearly. I would tell Gwendolyn everything, just not yet. Rosellen found me a rental, a small furnished apartment in West Asheville, 2nd floor, with a window that looked out over a yard with a dogwood tree in it. Month-to-month lease, no long-term commitment. The landlord was a retired teacher named Mr. Hensley, who rented the apartment specifically to people in transition, which was exactly the right word for what I was. The rent was $1,200 a month, which was manageable. I booked the move for the first weekend in September. Not movers. I didn't want a truck pulling up to my house and giving Marcus or anyone who might report to Marcus a reason to wonder. I rented a cargo van, and Patsy and her son Derek, who is built like a linebacker and has the most generous heart of any 34-year-old man I've ever met, came to help me pack the things that mattered most. The photographs, Earl's grandmother's quilt, the good dishes, my mother's recipe box in its faded green cardboard, the bird feeder, disassembled carefully, the gardening tools, the things that said Loretta was here, Loretta made this, Loretta chose this. The roses I couldn't take, obviously. But I took cuttings from 3 of the yellow climbers that grew against the back fence, cut them carefully on the last morning in the house, wrapped the stems in damp newspaper, and placed them in a bucket of water in the van. They would root in Asheville, in whatever garden I found. I was confident about that. On the last evening before I left, the Friday before the Saturday, I was supposed to use Marcus's one-way tickets to fly to Harlan to collect a few belongings before being deposited at Meadow Glen. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I sat at the table where Earl and I had made every major decision. I looked at the walls he'd built, and the floor he'd sanded, and the window above the sink where the cardinals came to the feeder on winter mornings. I talked to him, the way I sometimes do when I'm alone, and the need to speak to someone specific is greater than the absence of them. I told him what I was doing. I told him I was scared, which is true, which I don't mind admitting. I told him I thought he would have had opinions about all of it, probably delivered at some length and with a strong cup of coffee. I told him that whatever happened next, I needed him to know that this was not running away. This was the opposite of running away. Then I went to bed, and in the morning, I drove out of Harlan County on a Saturday in September with my cargo van and my cuttings and my irreplaceable things, and I headed for the mountains. The morning I was supposed to fly to Harlan on Marcus's one-way tickets, he drove to the Louisville airport to see Gwendolyn off to Kentucky for what she believed was helping her mother pack and prepare for the move to Meadow Glen. Gwendolyn called me at 7 in the morning from the departures level to say she was on her way. I let the call go to voicemail because I was at that moment already in Asheville, sitting in Mr. Hensley's kitchen on the 2nd floor of the West Asheville rental, drinking coffee from a mug I'd packed in my kitchen box, watching the dogwood tree in the yard below the window. I listened to her voicemail 3 times. Her voice was gentle and a little nervous, the way it gets when she's carrying something heavier than she's saying. She told me she loved me. She told me she was looking forward to seeing me and helping me get settled. She said that Meadow Glen was going to be wonderful, and she thought, once I gave it a chance, I would really love it there. I closed my eyes and listened to my daughter's voice telling me she was coming to take me somewhere I had never agreed to go, and I thought about the 11 years Marcus had spent reshaping her understanding of who I was. And I felt something that I am still not entirely able to name, a grief that was also a kind of determination, a love that was also a refusal. I called Gerald Whitmore first. Gerald was ready. We had planned this moment with the same precision I'd brought to everything else. He was prepared to contact Marcus's attorney with the documentation, the irrevocable trust, the competency statement, the notarized property declaration. The moment I gave him the word. I gave him the word. Then I called Gwendolyn. I called her from the Asheville apartment, with the dogwood tree visible from the window and a mug of coffee warm in my hand, and I told her the truth, all of it. Beginning with the Saturday morning in spring when Marcus first mentioned selling the house on the phone, moving through each of the signs I'd filed away and rationalized and tried to explain away, and ending with the email I'd read on her kitchen table in March, the one about the guardianship petition and the house proceeds, and Marcus working on her. The silence on the other end of the line was the longest silence I've ever shared with my daughter. It lasted long enough that I had to ask twice if she was still there. She was still there. She asked me about the email in a voice that had gone very quiet and very flat. Gwendolyn's voice, I realized then, does the same thing mine does when I'm making an enormous effort to stay controlled. She asked me what it said exactly. I told her exactly. I read her the words from the photo I'd taken, the photo I still had on my phone, the photo Gerald also had a copy of. Then I told her about the trust, about the financial accounts, about the Asheville apartment and the cargo van, and Patsy's son Derek, who had helped me carry Earl's grandmother's quilt up the stairs of Mr. Hensley's building. I told her I loved her. I told her I had never stopped loving her for one single day of her life, not even the complicated days, not even the days Marcus had made into something difficult between us. I told her that nothing I had done was about her. All of it was about me. about my right to make decisions about my own life, about the absolute refusal to be someone else's problem to be solved. I told her that the one-way tickets Marcus had purchased were real. They did accomplish a one-way trip, just not the one he'd planned. Gwendolyn was at the Louisville airport in the departures level, surrounded by the particular noise of a busy Saturday morning in a public space. She didn't answer for a long moment. Then I heard her say, very quietly, more to herself than to me, "He said you were confused. He said you were getting confused about things." "I know," I said. "I know what he said." "I believed him," she said. And there was so much in those 3 words, so much grief and anger and the specific, corrosive shame of having believed something that wasn't true about someone you loved. "Mom, I believed him." "I know, honey," I said. "He's very convincing. He's been practicing a long time." I heard her take a breath. Then she said, "I'm not getting on that plane." "You can come to Asheville instead," I said, "if you want to. I have a dogwood tree." There was a sound on the other end of the line that might have been a laugh and might have been a sob and was probably both. Then Gwendolyn said, "Give me the address." Gerald's calls went out that morning. Marcus's attorney received the trust documentation and the competency statement before noon. He received, additionally, a formal letter from Gerald noting the existence of the email about the guardianship petition as potential evidence of financial elder abuse under Kentucky law, and suggesting that any further attempts to interfere with Loretta May Hutchins' property or financial affairs would result in a formal complaint to the appropriate authorities. Marcus called my phone 14 times that Saturday. I did not answer once. He called Gerald's office twice, and Gerald handled those calls with the calm, thorough precision of a man who had spent 30 years doing exactly this. Gwendolyn arrived in Asheville that Saturday evening, having taken a rental car from Louisville and driven the 5 hours through the mountains in the failing September light. I heard her on the stairs and opened the apartment door, and she walked in and stood in my kitchen with her coat still on and looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Show me the email." I showed her the email. She read it twice. I watched her face change as she read it, a slow, painful reshuffling of something that had been arranged a certain way for a long time. She put my phone down on the kitchen table, and she was quiet for several minutes, long enough that I went and put the kettle on because I needed to do something with my hands. "How long?" she asked. "How long has he been doing this?" I sat down across from her, and I told her everything I'd observed, in order, from the first conversation about selling the house to the envelope with the blue bow. I was careful with the telling, not manipulative, not cruel, not designed to maximize damage to Marcus. Just the facts, in sequence, exactly as they had happened. I had promised myself I would not try to tell Gwendolyn how to feel about her marriage. That was hers to work out. The only thing that was mine to give her was the truth. When I was finished, she sat for a very long time. The kettle boiled, and I made tea, and she held her mug without drinking. Outside the window, the dogwood tree was dark against the September sky, and the lights of West Asheville were coming on, one by one, in the houses below. "I need to call a lawyer," she said. "Gerald can recommend someone," I said. She nodded. Then she looked around my kitchen, at the few things I'd unpacked. Earl's grandmother's quilt visible on the back of the living room chair, my mother's recipe box on the counter, and something in her expression shifted. Some last layer of the scaffolding Marcus had spent years building came down. "Is there room for me?" she asked. "Just for a few days, while I figure out what to do." "There's a pull-out sofa," I said. "It's not much." "I don't need much," she said. She stayed for 3 weeks. She filed for separation before the 3rd week was out. The divorce proceedings began 6 months later and were finalized the following March. Not without difficulty, not without the kind of legal maneuvering Marcus brought to everything he touched, but with the careful, patient support of the attorney Gerald had recommended, who turned out to be a woman in her early 50s named Helen Carey, who had exactly the kind of quiet, resolute competence the situation required. Marcus's attempts to challenge the trust were unsuccessful. The property on Clover Fork Road remained mine, irrevocably. I should say something about what it was like to be in Asheville in those early months, because I don't want to compress it into something simpler or more triumphant than it was. I had made the right decision. I knew that, with a certainty I'd rarely felt about anything. But right decisions are not always easy ones, and the weeks immediately after the move were some of the strangest and most disorienting of my life. I was 60 years old, and I had lived within 50 miles of my birthplace for my entire life. I knew Harlan County the way you know your own face, so completely that you stopped really seeing it years ago. In Asheville, I didn't know where anything was. I didn't know which roads flooded when it rained. I didn't know the good produce vendor at the farmer's market or which parking spots at the grocery store were angled badly. I didn't know the names of my neighbors or the history of the neighborhood or the rhythm of the light in different seasons. All of that knowing had to be built from scratch, and building from scratch at 60 is a slower process than it is at 30, and slower is not the same as impossible. Rosellen was there. That made everything easier. She arrived 2 days after I moved in, with a pot of her vegetable soup and a list of places she wanted to show me, and she spent the first 2 weeks being the guide I needed through the unfamiliar geography of my new city. She took me to the River Arts District, where the old industrial buildings along the French Broad River had been converted to studios and galleries, and the most improbable and wonderful collection of working artists I'd ever encountered in one place. She took me to the Saturday Farmers Market on the south slope of downtown, which is one of the finest markets I've ever seen, with vendors selling everything from heirloom tomatoes to handmade quilts to raw honey to Korean kimchi fermented in small batches by a retired chemistry professor. She took me to her community garden, which was a cooperative plot shared by 12 households, where she had a raised bed the size of a dining room table that she tended with the devotion of someone who understands that growing things is a form of sanity. I want to tell you about the community garden because it matters to the story in a way I didn't anticipate when I got there. Rosellen introduced me to the garden members, and among them was a woman named Dolores Fuentes, who was 63 years old, originally from Taos, New Mexico, and had come to Asheville 7 years earlier after her own version of a life rearranged by other people's decisions. Dolores had a plot next to Rosellen's and grew the most extraordinary pepper varieties I've ever tasted. And she had a directness that I found immediately comfortable, the directness of a woman who had done her own version of whatever I was doing and had no patience left for anything but honesty. "You look like someone who just got her feet under her," Dolores said, the first afternoon we met, with a frankness that should have startled me and didn't. "It's a particular expression. I know it because I've had it." "Is it obvious?" I asked. "Only to people who've been there," she said. I planted my rose cuttings in Dolores's garden, in a corner she offered me when she heard about them. 3 of the 5 cuttings rooted. By the following spring, there were blooms, not as full as the climbers on the fence at Clover Fork Road, not yet, but real and yellow and alive. I photographed them and sent the photo to Gwendolyn, who was living in a small rented apartment in Louisville by then, navigating her separation with the combination of pain and clarity that comes from seeing something you've chosen carefully begin to fall apart. She wrote back, "They're beautiful, Mom. I'm glad you got them out of there." The community garden led to other things, as community always does. Dolores was part of a women's group that met weekly at a local community center. Not a therapy group exactly, more of a mutual support circle for women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who were navigating transitions. Divorce, widowhood, relocation, retirement, reinvention. Women at the age that society tends to look past gathered in a circle on Tuesday evenings to speak directly and honestly about the particular texture of that experience. I started going in November, 3 months after I arrived in Asheville. I also improbably found work. Not the tax office. I was done with that chapter, though I was grateful for every year of it. a small nonprofit organization in downtown Asheville that provided free tax preparation services for low-income families, ran a volunteer program, and they were in need of people with exactly the kind of document management and tax code experience I'd spent 22 years acquiring. I went in to volunteer and was offered a part-time paid position 3 weeks later, coordinating the volunteer program and handling the intake organization. It was 20 hours a week, and it paid less than my county job had, but I was not working for the money. I was working because I am, at my core, a person who needs to be useful, who needs to have a purpose that extends beyond herself, and that need doesn't retire just because someone decides you're old enough to be managed. Gwendolyn came to visit for Thanksgiving of 2017, the first Thanksgiving after the move. She drove from Louisville in a car she'd bought herself, a small, practical Honda that she'd chosen with no input from Marcus. She arrived on the Wednesday before the holiday, and she walked into the Asheville apartment with her overnight bag and her contribution to the meal. She'd made her grandmother's sweet potato casserole from my mother's recipe, and when she set it on the counter next to the things I was preparing, I felt something that I cannot fully articulate, something that had to do with continuity and resilience and the specific way that certain things survive everything you put them through. We cooked together in that kitchen for 2 days. We talked, really talked, in ways we hadn't managed in years, not through the layer of glass Marcus had installed, but directly as ourselves, as mother and daughter who knew each other's whole history and didn't need to perform anything for anyone else's benefit. She told me things about the marriage that I had suspected and things that surprised me. I told her things about my own life that she hadn't known, about the grief after her father died, about the loneliness I'd managed quietly, about the fear I'd felt reading Marcus's email and the determination that had come immediately after it. She cried, on Thanksgiving afternoon, sitting on the floor of the living room with her back against the couch and her knees pulled to her chest. Not the kind of crying that needs to be fixed or stopped, but the kind that's clearing something out, making room for something else. I sat next to her on the floor and didn't say anything for a while, because that's what was needed. Then I said, "You're going to be okay, not right away, but you will." She looked at me sideways. "How do you know?" "Because you're Gwendolyn Hutchins," I said. "You were born knowing what you want. You just forgot for a while." She laughed, which is the most Gwendolyn thing she could have done, and then she wiped her eyes and went to check on the sweet potato casserole. Marcus's legal challenges to the property trust were dismissed in early 2018. The guardianship petition he had apparently drafted but not yet filed, Gerald had warned me it was being prepared, was never submitted once Gerald's documentation made clear the legal burden of proof that would have been required and the evidence that existed, pointing in a very inconvenient direction. Marcus and his attorney went quiet after that. Gwendolyn's divorce attorney handled the rest with efficiency and thoroughness, and by March of 2018, Gwendolyn Hutchins was her own person again in every legal sense that the law provides. I returned to Harlan County in April of 2018 to visit Earl's grave. I drove down on a Thursday morning, made the 3-mile trip out to the churchyard, and stood at his headstone in the spring sunshine with the yellow roses blooming around the marker, the same roses I'd planted there the year he died, the parent plants of the cuttings now rooting in Dolores's community garden in West Asheville. I told him what had happened. I told him about Marcus and the envelope and Gerald Whitmore and the cargo van and Patsy and Derek and the dogwood tree. I told him about the community garden and Dolores and the Tuesday Women's Circle and the nonprofit and the sweet potato casserole on Thanksgiving and Gwendolyn crying on the living room floor. I told him all of it. Then I told him that I was not the same woman who had buried him in November of 2014. Something had happened between that November and this April that I could not have predicted and would not have chosen, and that had changed me in ways I was still measuring. Not broken me. Changed me. Clarified me, the way a long illness clarifies what matters to a person, or a narrow escape clarifies what is worth protecting. I put fresh roses on his grave, and I drove back to Asheville. The house on Clover Fork Road is still mine. I rent it now to a young couple who are both teachers at Harlan County High School and who have a small dog and have already put their own things in the kitchen and painted the living room a color Earl would have called audacious. I drive down twice a year to check on things and visit the grave. I am not sentimental about the house in the way I once was. It is a place, not an identity, and the distinction matters. My identity lives in me, and I have learned to take it with me wherever I go. I am 67 years old as I tell you this story, and I want to be precise about what those 7 years between the envelope with the blue bow and this Tuesday morning in West Asheville have cost and given me. They have cost me the certainty that the people I love will always act in my interests. That is a hard thing to lose. The confidence that love is sufficient protection, that family means safety, that the people who were there at the beginning will be there at the end and mean the same thing. Marcus showed me that none of that is guaranteed, and while I would not choose the lesson, I am grateful for the knowing. They have given me, in return, something more durable than certainty. They have given me the knowledge of my own resources, not the financial ones, though those matter and I am not naive about them. The ones inside, the ones I didn't know were there until they were needed. The ability to plan calmly under pressure, to act without announcing, to accept help without shame, to leave what cannot be saved and build what can. They have given me Dolores, who is now one of my closest friends and who gave me 5 rooted pepper cuttings last fall to plant in the new garden plot I finally claimed for myself at the cooperative. They have given me Rosellen, who was already my sister-in-law but is now also my neighbor, having moved 3 streets over from the rental into a smaller house after Calvin retired, and they decided to simplify. They have given me the Tuesday Circle, and the women in it. 8 of us now, though the membership shifts as people find their feet and move on to what's next. They have given me a part-time job I find genuinely meaningful. They have given me the French Broad River, which I walk along most mornings before work, watching the herons. They have given me Gwendolyn, new. Not the daughter I raised, though she is that too, but a Gwendolyn who has done her own version of the work I did, who has looked clearly at what she was choosing and made deliberate decisions about what she wants her life to be. She is in Louisville still, in an apartment she has made entirely her own, and she is good. She is genuinely, specifically, unmistakably good. We talk 3 times a week and visit for every holiday, and she is teaching herself to grow herbs on her apartment balcony. She sent me a photograph last week of her first successful basil plant with a caption that said it reminded her of my kitchen, and I sat with that for a long time, feeling something warm and complicated and ultimately very good. I want to speak now to any woman who is listening to this story and recognizing something in it. Not necessarily the specifics. Maybe it isn't a son-in-law, maybe it isn't a care facility, maybe the envelope in your life has a different return address. But the feeling of someone else building a plan for your life without consulting you, and the terrible temptation to call that plan love and go along with it, because going along is what you've been trained to do. I want to tell you that training can be unlearned. It is never too late to rewrite the story you've been handed. I know that sounds like something stitched on a pillow, the kind of sentiment that is easy to say and impossible to use. But I mean it in the most practical, specific, literal way. It is never too late to call an attorney. It is never too late to talk to a trusted friend about what you've been seeing. It is never too late to photograph an email. It is never too late to rent a cargo van and drive away from the place someone else chose for you toward the place you choose for yourself. It is never too late to plant your cuttings somewhere new and watch them take root. I was 60 years old when I drove out of Harlan County with my cargo van and my roses. I am 67 years old right now, and I am sitting at a kitchen table in West Asheville with a heron visible from the window and the smell of coffee in the air, and every single day of my life fully, completely, irrevocably my own. Nobody put me here. I put myself here, and that makes all the difference. Before I say goodbye, I want to ask you for something. If this story meant anything to you, if Loretta's roses mean anything to you. If the blue bow on that envelope, or the dogwood tree in the yard, or Gwendolyn sitting on the living room floor means anything to you, please give this video a like. It takes 1 second, and it tells the channel that stories like this one matter. Please subscribe if you haven't, so the next woman's story finds its way to you. And leave me a comment. Tell me what part of this stayed with you. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me where in this world you're watching from right now. I want to know you're out there. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber is how these stories reach the women who need them most. Thank you. From the bottom of my working class, rose planting, cargo van driving heart, thank you. It is never too late to trade someone else's plan for a life that is genuinely, wholly, stubbornly your own. I am living proof. Take good care of yourselves and watch out for envelopes with bows on them.